Once upon a time, in the city of Ibadan, there lived a woman whose name was Ayomi. She was beautiful, elegant, and known for her calm nature. People often said that she was blessed because she was married to one of the richest men in the city named Shola Peters. To outsiders, they were the perfect couple. Their mansion gleamed with marble floors, their cars lined the driveway, and their love seemed untouchable. At every party, they arrived hand in hand, and Naomi was praised as the woman who tamed the lion. But what people did not know was that her nights were filled with tears. Her husband's phone always buzzed at odd hours. Strange numbers appeared and disappeared. Trips that were supposed to be business meetings always ended with him coming home smelling of a strange perfume. At first, Ayomi tried to ignore it. She cooked his meals with love, dressed in her finest clothes, and prayed like her life depended on it. But the more she prayed, the colder Shola became. He seized every opportunity to be away from her, acting as though her presence was suffocating. Even when they lay on the same bed, Ayomi could feel the distance between them. Intimacy was like a chore, and Ayomi could not place what she could be doing wrong. She spoke to her friend Funke, who advised her to change her wardrobe, saying that men tend to get bored easily. Maybe you should try something new, like wearing bolder dresses. Surprise him in the bedroom. Remind him that he still has the most beautiful woman in Ibadan as his wife, she said to Ayomi, who nodded in excitement as she made up her mind to go shopping. Ayomi bought new clothes and switched her perfumes. She even learned new recipes just to please her husband, but Shola seemed not to notice. He arrived home that evening and walked past her as if she did not exist. Ayomi stood there broken as tears poured down her eyes. Even the food that she prepared went to waste as Shola informed her that he had already eaten. "I'm not hungry," he muttered as he headed straight for his bedroom. Ayomi's heart sank as tears stung her eyes. Her hours of cooking went down the drain as she wondered who the woman was behind her pain. Days turned into weeks, and the coldness between them grew thicker. Shola became secretive with his phone, hiding it under his pillow at night and clutching it whenever it buzzed. One night, Ayomi tried to reach for it while he slept, but Shola snapped at her angrily. "What are you doing? Don't ever touch my phone." His tone was so sharp that it made Ayomi freeze. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. The thought that haunted her was not just who he was cheating with, but why. Why did her prayers, her efforts, her sacrifices seem invisible to him? And why has her husband decided to neglect her because of another woman? One evening, while she was folding laundry in her bedroom, her eye fell on something strange inside his drawer, a tube of lubricant. Ayomi froze. Her husband had never needed it with her. Why then was it there? And worse, why did it look half-used? That night, while Shola snored beside her, Ayomi lay awake. Thoughts raced through her mind like wildfire as she wondered who this strange woman could be. Then, an idea entered her mind. Dangerous, risky, but Ayomi was prepared to risk it. She was desperate for answers and was willing to do anything to get it. The next morning, when Shola left for work, Ayomi crept into the drawer. She picked up the lubricant, her hands trembling as she carried it into the kitchen. She opened the bottle of hot chili oil that she used to make pepper soup, an oil that was so hot that it could set one's tongue on fire. Ayomi carefully poured it into the lubricant. She shook it well, her eyes hard as stone, as she waited patiently for her plan to unfold. Days passed, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. Shola moved about as normal. He kissed her cheek before bed and smiled at her gently as he replied his messages on his phone. Ayomi could not contain her anger. She knew who he was chatting with and could not help but look at herself as a fool. Ayomi had not been this angry in her life. She could not wait for her plan to work. She could not wait to find out if truly her husband had been cheating on her. The night it happened, Ayomi felt it in her bones. Shola returned from another meeting, his eyes red with tears as he rushed into the house and disappeared into the bathroom. Minutes later, Ayomi heard it, A sound so sharp, so piercing, that it cut through the silence of the mansion. The scream was not his usual control tone. This was pain, raw, unfiltered pain. The bathroom door flung open as Shola staggered out, clutching himself, his face contorted in agony. He fell to his knees on the marble floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Ayomi's heart pounded as she rushed towards him, her face painted with false panic. "My husband! What is it?" she cried, but deep inside she knew that her plan had worked. Shola rolled on the floor like a man possessed, his skin burning from the inside out. His phone slipped from his pocket in the struggle. Ayomi grabbed it quickly. The screen was still unlocked, and what she saw almost made her faint. Message after message from a number that she did not recognize. "Baby, what did you do to me? I'm in pain," the person said, as Ayomi's eyes opened in shock. Her hands trembled as the room began to spin. Her husband, the mighty Shola Peters, the man who stood in church with his hands lifted high, was now cheating on her in the worst way possible. Although she knew what he had done, she still had no idea who he was cheating with. As a medical doctor, Ayomi insisted that a test be carried out, pretending not to know what the root cause of the problem could be. Shola was hesitant at first, but seeing the pain that he was going through, he decided to give in. A test was carried out, and the results revealed that he had an incurable STD. Ayomi's heart stopped for a moment. She stared at her husband as the ground beneath her feet began to shake. Shola's face grew pale. He could not believe it. He broke into a cold sweat and began pacing the room like a man awaiting his execution. That night, as Ayomi pretended to be asleep, she overheard her husband in the balcony. His voice was low at first, but he rose in fury as he began to argue on the phone. "You infected me! Do you hear me? You gave me STD!" he roared, slamming his fist against the wall. "Do you want to destroy my life? Do you want to end everything I've built?" Ayomi's blood ran cold. She lay trembling in the dark, her mind racing as she listened to his voice. However, the days that followed were a complete nightmare. Ayomi could not take her mind off all that had happened. She confronted her husband, but he denied ever cheating with another woman. Ayomi could not believe her ears. She could not believe that after everything that had happened, her husband would look her in the eyes and lie. All the business meetings and all the late night engagements now made sense to her. The nights when she could not reach him on the phone, the nights when he returned home smelling of strange perfume, all came flooding back in one painful realization. But still, something did not add up. She searched his things, hoping to find a clue of who the woman could be, but nothing in his belongings gave her a clue. Ayomi was so full of rage. She called her best friend Funke, hoping to get some comfort from her, but Funke's calls all went unanswered. Ayomi tried to send a message to their group chat, but to her shock, she discovered that Funke had already left the group without a word. Ayomi stared at her phone in disbelief. Funke, her best friend of over 15 years, the woman who knew every detail of her life, had left their group chat without saying a word. Her chest tightened as confusion gave way to suspicion. Why would Funke cut ties so suddenly, just when Ayomi's world was crumbling? Days turned into weeks, and the silence from Funke became deafening. Calls went unanswered. Messages stopped delivering as Funke blocked her number without a word. Ayomi went to her house on several occasions, but each time, the security guards turned her away with cold faces, saying, "Madam said you are not allowed inside." Ayomi could not understand what could have happened. Funke, her best friend and sister in all but blood, suddenly stopped speaking to her. She blocked her number and all means of communication with her, and Ayomi could not help but suspect that something was definitely wrong. She tried calling Funke's husband daily to know why Funke had suddenly cut her off, but Funke's husband warned her never to come close to them again. Ayomi knew in that instant that something had happened. She could feel the tension in the air, but what cut deepest was Funke's silence. Funke, who used to know her every thought, now acted strangely for no just cause, and Ayomi, though she did not want to believe it, found herself wondering if Funke had anything to do with her husband. The suspicion grew heavier by the day. choking her like a rope around her neck. Shola, on the other hand, grew more restless by the day. He paced the house like a caged animal, snapping at the staff and avoiding Ayomi like a plague. At night, when he thought she was asleep, Ayomi would hear him whisper on the phone, his tone switching between rage and desperation. One evening, unable to hold it any longer, Ayomi confronted her husband again. "Who is she, Shola?" she demanded, asking if Funke had anything to do with it. Immediately she called her friend's name. Her husband flinched in a way that raised suspicion in her mind. However, he twisted his face in rage, yelling angrily that there was no woman. "Ayomi, stop accusing me of things you know nothing about," he said to Ayomi, who stood there and watched as his words pierced her chest like a blade. She knew that Shola would never admit to her, so she decided to find out the truth herself, even if it was the last thing that she did. Ayomi searched through her husband's car. She came across a receipt of a hotel, which she suspects her husband frequents with his mistress. The date on the receipt was the date that her husband lied that he was going on a business trip to Lagos. Ayomi decided to pretend as if everything was fine. She needed to catch her husband in the act and knew that any form of suspicious behavior would trigger a warning to her husband. So she acted unbothered, waiting for her husband's next move, hoping to uncover the mystery herself. She installed the tracker in her husband's car, careful not to arouse any form of suspicion. To Shola, she was the same Ayomi, calm, smiling and dutiful, but inside, her heart was raging like fire. That evening, her husband called to inform her that he had a late night meeting in the office and won't make it home until morning. "I will be sleeping in the office," he said as Ayomi praised him for his hard work. She urged him to get something to eat, and Shola smiled, assuring her that he would do so. He hung up the call and moved straight to his car as he made his way out of the office. Ayomi sat back in her bedroom watching as her husband's car navigated the streets of Ibadan. She followed the blinking dots on the tracker, her heart pounding faster with every turn. Ayomi tried to give him the benefit of a doubt. Maybe he's going to get food, she said to herself as her eyes continued to follow the dots on the tracker. Shola did not drive towards any fast food joint. Instead, he drove to one of the most expensive hotels around, the same hotel that Ayomi saw on the receipt in his car. Ayomi could not contain her rage. The sting of betrayal cut deeper than she could ever imagine. So, she got into her car and drove to the hotel, determined to find out who this strange woman was. Ayomi parked discreetly by the hotel. To her surprise, she saw her husband's car, parked next to her friend's own car. Funke was in the same hotel as her husband. Ayomi froze in her seat, her eyes glued to the cars, which were now parked side by side. Her throat tightened as her vision blurred with tears. It can't be. Funke, my best friend? Her heart pounded like a drum in her chest. Slowly, she stepped out of her car and walked towards the hotel entrance, each step heavy as though the ground wanted to swallow her whole. The receptionist looked up when she entered. Ayomi flashed her hospital ID card, her voice steady although her hands trembled. "Today is my husband's birthday and I want to surprise him. I have been away for years and I arranged for him to be brought here so he doesn't know that I am coming. If you call him, the surprise is ruined. Please, I beg you, don't alert him," she said to the receptionist, who smiled and handed her the number of her husband's room. Ayomi's stomach twisted. She climbed into the elevator, her chest pounding like a drum. When she arrived at the door of room 309, she heard muffled voices floating through the walls. Ayomi pressed her ear closer and froze at what she heard. It wasn't Funke's voice. In fact, it wasn't the voice of any woman. It was Funke's husband Dele, asking why my husband had been avoiding him. Ayomi listened painfully as Dele narrated how he convinced his wife Funke that Ayomi made a move on him. Dele lied to his wife that her best friend Ayomi wanted to sleep with him. That was why Funke blocked Ayomi everywhere without a word. Dele explained that he did it to break their relationship, knowing that Ayomi had begun to suspect Shola of infidelity. Ayomi staggered backwards, her body shaking violently as she began to stammer to herself. How can this be? Dele, the man who had shared meals in her home, the man who had smiled in her face while secretly destroying her life. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she clutched her chest. The betrayal was far deeper than she imagined, not just from her husband, but from the man who poisoned her friendship, convincing Funke to hate her with lies so that their dark affair would remain hidden. Downstairs, she saw Funke's car still parked. The realization hit her harder than a thunderclap. Funke was not inside with Shola. She had been abandoned, deceived and turned against her best friend, while her own husband carried on his relationship with Shola. Ayomi stumbled back to her car, her hands trembling so badly that she could barely start the engine. Her world had shattered in ways that no form of explanation could fix. That night, as the mansion loomed empty around her, Ayomi made up her mind to strike back. She could not believe that her husband made her feel like she wasn't enough. Ayomi could not understand why Shola decided to marry her when he knew fully well that he was not into women. She felt so terrible to be betrayed into a marriage that had no future. All the men that she had turned down just to be with Shola, a man who knew fully well that he was not into women, came flooding back to her mind like ghosts who were all mocking her. Her chest ached as she sat in the dark, staring at the wedding portrait that hung in their living room. There she was, smiling in her white gown, holding on to the arm of a man who had built their entire life together on lies. A man who used her beauty as a cover, her dignity as a shield, her womb as a disguise for his secret. Ayomi broke down in tears, her sobs echoing against the walls of the mansion. She wasn't crying because Shola cheated. She wasn't crying because her friend had abandoned her. She cried because her very existence as his wife had been a lie. The next morning, Ayomi wiped her tears and looked at herself in the mirror. Something inside her had shifted. No longer was she the calm, patient wife who prayed and cooked for a man who despised her. She was a woman scorned who was now ready to take back her life. Ayomi moved out of the house before Shola returned. No one knew where she had gone, and her husband began to tell everyone that his wife had absconded with another man. People began to blame her for their failed marriage. While pitying her husband, they turned Ayomi into a villain in the whole story, and Ayomi could not believe that she had been married to her worst enemy. Even her best friend Funke began to tell people that Ayomi tried to sleep with her husband Dele. She narrated how she cut her off like a bad habit, stating that people like Ayomi were green snakes in the green grass. She praised her husband Dele for rejecting her friend Ayomi, stating that her husband was the most faithful man in the entire world. One evening, whilst Funke was home, she received an image of Ayomi with another man walking into a hotel. The sender dropped the room number in the text, and Funke could not help but go. She could not wait to see the look on Ayomi's face when she caught her red-handed in the act. Funke's chest rose and fell with excitement as she drove to the hotel. Her mind was already rehearsing the words that she would shout, the insults that she would throw, the way she would finally expose Ayomi to the world as the shameless woman that she was. She stormed into the hotel lobby, her heels clicking on the tiles. When she got to the room, she flung the door open with fury, but what she saw stopped her cold in her tracks. There was no man there, only Ayomi sitting calmly at the table, sipping a glass of wine, her eyes hard as stone. Funke could not help but stammer. She had expected to see Ayomi with a man, but was shocked when she saw her all alone in the room. "Where is he?" she asked Ayomi coldly, as Ayomi looked up at her and smiled. "You mean this man here?" she asked Funke, who she showed the exact image that she had sent to her phone. "I sent you that image, Funke, because I know that that's the only way I'll be able to get your attention." Funke could not hide her rage. She began to call Ayomi all sorts of unflattering names, accusing her of trying to sleep with her husband Dele. "You think he'll fall for you, you pretentious snake," Funke spat, her voice shaking with fury. Ayomi did not flinch. She stood up slowly, her calmness more frightening than a scream. "Funke, I called you here because there's something you need to see. Something that would tear open the lies that you've been living in." Before Funke could respond, Ayomi showed her a picture of her husband Dele. walking into the same hotel. Your dear loving husband is next door with his lover, she said to Funke, whose lips quivered at the thought of it. At first, she found it hard to believe. However, seeing her husband in the same attire that she picked out for him that morning made her believe that the image was not fake. She walked to his room door, her heart beating as she knocked on the door and said nothing. Her chest rose and fell like a drum, her heart pounding so loudly that she could barely hear her own thoughts. Inside, there was a sudden silence. Then the sound of footsteps. "Who is it?" came her husband's nervous voice as he approached the door. Funke froze. Her lips trembled, her mind refusing to process what she had just heard. As the door opened, she barged into the room with a force. The scene before her sent a scream clawing up her throat. There on the bed was her husband's friend Shola, flustered, his face red with guilt as her husband stood in front of her, trying to convince her that it was not what it looked like. Funke could not believe her eyes. She wailed, staggering backwards as her hands flew to her head in shock. "This cannot be," she said as Ayomi walked in that moment with a smirk on her face. "You all labeled me the villain at the first opportunity that you got. You said I absconded with another man, just to cover up your own deeds. I knew of your relationship, and that was why I left without a word. I didn't want you knowing that I know, because I wanted you to be careless because of a day like this." Ayomi's voice was calm, but it sliced through the room like a blade. "You see, Funke, all the whispers, all the lies you believed about me were planted by the man who you trusted the most. Dele convinced you that I was after him, while Shola used me as his cover. I was the mask that they both wore to hide their secret." Funke's knees buckled as she let out a painful cry. "Dele, how could you?" Dele reached for her, his voice trembling as he began to speak. "Funke, it's not what it looks like. Please don't believe anything that she's saying," he said to Funke, who slapped his hand away. "Don't touch me! Don't you dare touch me! I defended you. I stood in the street and told people that Ayomi was a snake, that my husband was the most faithful man in Ibadan, and all this time, you were crawling into each other's arms like thieves in the night." Ayomi stepped forward, her eyes blazing with unshed tears. "Funke, I wanted you to see this with your own eyes, because if I told you, you would never have believed me. You were blinded by their lies. Now the truth is here, raw and ugly. What you choose to do with this is up to you," she said as she informed Shola that she had already filed for a divorce. "You will hear from my lawyer soon," she said as she walked out of the hotel, her head held high as Funke ran after her to apologize. "I didn't know, Ayomi. Please forgive me," she said to Ayomi, who smiled at her and shook her head. "The least you could have done was give me a listening ear. You never gave me a chance to explain myself. You believed the lies and even went ahead to feed people the same lies. I forgive you, Funke, because he lied to you. But Funke, we can never be friends again, because trust, once broken, can never be rebuilt the same way. You shattered mine the moment you chose gossip over our sisterhood." Funke fell to her knees in the hotel corridor, her tears flowing freely. "Ayomi, please, I was blind. I was foolish. I let him turn me against you. I should have known better. I should have known that you would never betray me." Ayomi looked down at her, her heart torn between compassion and pain. She crouched slightly, lifting Funke's chin so their eyes met. "You didn't just doubt me, Funke. You helped bury me with your silence when I needed you most." "You didn't just doubt me, Funke. You helped bury me with your silence when I needed you the most. You joined them in making me the villain. That's not what friends do." She stood tall again, adjusted her dress and walked away. The days that followed shook the city of Ibadan to its core. Rumors spread like wildfire as the truth clawed its way into the open. Shola's once spotless reputation disintegrated overnight. Dele lost his contract as Funke's family withdrew all the funding that they had provided for his business. Funke vanished from social gatherings, unable to withstand the shame. However, Ayomi rose. She rebuilt her life again, channeling her pain into purpose. Her medical career flourished as her name grew, not as the wife of Shola Peters, but as Ayomi, the woman who survived betrayal and turned her scars into strength. And every time she came across her old wedding portrait, she smiled, not in sorrow, but in triumph, because the woman in that white gown had died the day she poured chili oil into her husband's lies. The lesson to be learned from this story is that betrayal often comes wrapped in familiar faces, but the truth always finds a way to surface. Blind trust without discernment can destroy years of love and friendship, while courage to face the truth, even when it hurts, opens the door to freedom. Ayomi's pain taught her that self-worth is never defined by who chooses to love or betray you, but by the strength you carry to rise above deceit and rebuild your life with dignity. I hope you enjoyed the story.